Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening? With me, your host, Chris Hayes. I'm very excited today for another edition of our special series where we take a look at all the implications, both terrifying and exhilarating, of artificial intelligence, its philosophical implications, its social, economic, and political implications. You know, we've been using this term, and you'll see this term called the Turing test. And that refers to the brilliant, one of the great minds of the last century, Alan Turing, British philosopher, computational scientist, who basically came up with this idea of, well, how would you know a machine is intelligent? And the Turing test was, you would know it's intelligent if you can talk to the machine and not know it's a machine. It's just it would convincingly impersonate a person to the point that you couldn't distinguish. Now, what's crazy is for a long time, this was kind of the bar. Can you make a machine that under, interrogation, essentially, a set of repeated interactions, you had no idea it was a machine? I think fair to say that we have passed that bar. In fact, I don't know if you've had this experience. I've had an experience of talking to customer service chatbots and genuinely not knowing if I was talking to AI or person. In fact, even having the somewhat humiliating experience of being like, are you a real person? So that part of the Turing test is getting passed right now. And yet, I think we still want to say that there's something different between me on this side of the chat with the customer service bot and the customer service bot. And the big difference is that I've got this little me inside me. I'm a conscious agent. I'm a subject. I see the world. I listen to music. I get sad when I think about sad things, right? All the things that make up what we call my interior life, I don't think that, chatbot has. And no matter how good it got at replicating natural speech, I've got this thing which makes me a human. I've also got an embodied, physical corpus. I've got this thing that makes me human that it doesn't have. And that thing is, the word we use for it is consciousness. I've got consciousness. The chatbot doesn't have consciousness. But could the chatbot ever have consciousness? How sure are we that in the same way that it seemed preposterous for a machine to pass the Turing test, we don't get to a point where the machines maybe do have that experience, have inner lives? This sounds incredibly sci-fi, but I will tell you, as someone who's been around the AI discussion for a long time, breezily passing the Turing test seemed like sci-fi for a long time, and we've sort of shot past it. So to talk about consciousness, this thing that I think we all intuit makes us human, makes us distinct. It's the thing that rules our whole lives because everything passes through the framework of this interior little thing inside here. I'm talking to, I think, arguably the foremost expert on the topic. David Chalmers is a philosopher, cognitive scientist. He's an author. He's professor of philosophy and neuroscience at NYU. He's co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU. He is widely recognized as one of the foremost philosophical and scientific experts on consciousness. I've been reading your work for decades, and it's wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
You got interested in this problem exceedingly young, if I'm not mistaken. What first triggered you on the problem of consciousness?
Growing up, I was I guess I was a math geek, really into math, computer science, physics, and so on. But somewhere along the way, I got obsessed by the human mind and by the problem of consciousness. One thing I remember actually was just as a young kid, at one point, they realized I was short-sighted in one eye and that I needed glasses. At a certain point, I got glasses and the world kind of popped out into 3 dimensions.
It's an amazing feeling when you get glasses for the first time, where you're like, oh, this is what it should be like.
I thought the world was 3D already, but suddenly, no, it's like the world had depth. And I could tell a story about the processes of binocular vision, where the eyes would compute the distance of the things. But that wasn't what I was concerned with. My question was, why does it feel like something to experience the world in depth? In 3D, where does that subjective experience come from? And in retrospect, that was a question about consciousness. Why does everything that the brain does feel like something from the inside? And that just struck me as the most interesting unsolved problem in the universe.
How should we think about defining what consciousness is? It gets very slippery when you start to get your hands around it. And I think it can be hard to think about because it's like the old joke about the fish in the water, where the older fish says to the 2 younger fish, enjoy the water. And he turns to his companion and goes, what's the water? What's water, right? It can't but be the case that consciousness suffuses our entire experience of the world. So How should we think about what it is?
Yeah, everything is consciousness. I define consciousness as subjective experience, anything which feels like something from the first person point of view. There's a phrase that philosophers like to use, which is what it's like to be you. Consciousness is somehow what it's like to be me. My colleague at NYU, Tom Nagel, wrote a famous article called "What is it like to be a bat?" We don't know what it's like to be a bat using sonar to get around and so on, but we assume there's something it's like to be a bat. There's something it's like for the bat from the bat's perspective. And if there is, then we say the bat is conscious. Now, maybe this coffee cup, on the other hand, maybe there's nothing it's like to be the coffee cup. That's what most people would say, in which case the coffee cup is not conscious. But for some privileged class of objects in the universe, including human beings, or at least including me, hopefully you, hopefully the rest of us, there's something it's like to be them. They're actually beings with subjective experience. We think also probably animals.
Yeah.
A dog or a cat or maybe even a fish. That could be something it's like to be them.
I mean, I think any pet owner has had this experience, right, of where you try, a bat, I think, is too remote for us. That's a great paper, obviously, very, very, the classic paper on this by Thomas Nagel. But any pet owner, I have a dog, you're observing the behaviors of the dog, and then you try to think you do imply mental states to the dog. Like when she's happy, she wags her tail. And I don't just say to myself, well, that's a behavior. She's wagging her tail. I think she's happy. She's feeling something. I am quite convinced, I may be wrong, but I'm quite convinced that she's feeling a thing inside herself.
That's right. And we have to distinguish in this area behavior, which is like the things we can do and objectively measure from the outside, from subjective experience, what it's like from the inside. As you say, we normally see a system behaving intelligently, and we take that as a sign that there's something like consciousness going on the inside. But we have to distinguish those two things. Sometimes people distinguish intelligence, which is the capacity to do sophisticated things, from consciousness, which is what it feels like from the inside. And of course, now in the era of AI, we're coming to a point where that reasoning from behavior to consciousness, from intelligence to consciousness, maybe those two things could be, in principle, coming apart. AI systems are increasingly intelligent, but are they conscious? Is there something it's like to be an AI system? Does it have subjective experience? That's far from obvious.
So let's talk about this. Let's stay on this about the category of things that we think have consciousness. A plant responds to stimulus in its environment. It grows towards the light. But we don't think of the plant as having consciousness. Why not? What's the next level? Like, what's the sea slug, the worm, the ant? I want to say that like a little finch, a little bird, a hummingbird probably to me is conscious, but it's hard for me to think of as a worm as conscious. But like, where am I drawing these distinctions?
It's interesting. The consensus on these things has gradually gotten more inclusive about consciousness as the years have gone by. Centuries ago, René Descartes thought humans and only humans are conscious. No non-human animals are conscious. A few decades ago, when I was
to him, like a cow was like ChatGPT. It just had it was a purely mechanical being, right? There were inputs and outputs. It didn't have an inner life.
Pure automaton, right? Yeah, for Descartes. Even when I was getting started in this field 3 decades ago, I'd say, okay, sure, maybe other primates are conscious, a few mammals, but maybe it doesn't go beyond there. Whereas if you ask these days, you're in the field of scientists, philosophers, most people are, I think, prepared to concede consciousness to all mammals, even a mouse for sure. In fact, a lot of the experiments in this field are on mice.
Well,
even fish.
Let's talk about that, because what's interesting there is, and this is something I think that you're partly responsible for, right? Is the idea of like, can we start to treat these problems in some scientific fashion, not just philosophically speculative, right? Not just reasoning from principles, but actually try to test things. And so if we've made some, let's concede we've made some progress in our understanding that has allowed us to enlarge. How do you start to test this stuff, right? What evidence in the world, given that the fact is definitionally interior, could you start to find that would cause you to rethink your priors, your categories, and say, oh, actually, it turns out a mouse is conscious?
Our best source of evidence about consciousness, well, actually, the very best source of evidence. It comes from my own consciousness, my own first-person experience. I know I'm conscious. I know what I'm conscious of. But I'm usually prepared to extend this, at the very least, to other human beings. I find out what someone else is conscious of by asking them. I could say, hey, Chris, what are you experiencing right now? And you tell me what you're experiencing. And I take that as evidence about what's in your consciousness. The moment we go beyond, though, the normal adult human case, like to non-human animals, well, we can no longer use verbal reports because, these animals don't speak. Same issue comes up for thinking about a baby's consciousness. So we have to go with something more indirect. And one approach which has been very successful has been looking for correlates of consciousness in the human case, processes in the brain which are active when we have conscious experience. People call those the neural correlates of consciousness. And then we see if we can detect those in animals or in babies or in other systems.
Right. So when I'm instructed to think some thoughts and I use my sort of conscious willpower to do whatever, and they scan my brain and they see some part of the brain that appears to be correlated with that activity. And then I look at like a mouse or I look at a chimpanzee and see if there's similar neural activity, I can kind of infer, it's not conclusive, but I can infer that it's probably something similar happening on the interior because it looks like this thing.
Exactly. There are also behaviors that seem to correlate with consciousness in humans, certain complex forms of memory or planning, which at least in the adult human case seem to require consciousness to do. So if we find out, for example, that babies contract complex stimuli of a kind which in an adult requires consciousness, then we say, okay, maybe that's evidence that these babies are having some subjective experience. And now people are finding even insects can do certain kinds of complex tasks and conditionings that would require consciousness if done in humans. And some people use that to argue that insects are conscious. Although I've got to say, this is very far from conclusive. Insects are it's interesting though, people used to argue about mammals. Now we're accepting most mammals, maybe even fish, and we're arguing about whether insects are conscious.
Yeah, we've moved down the chain of being.
Plants are still on the far side of the horizon. There are a few people arguing for plant consciousness.
Are there?
Yeah, actually, we took a survey on this. About 10% of scientists and philosophers in this area were prepared to concede consciousness in plants.
So to go back to Descartes, who, sort of one of the, in the history of sort of what we call modern philosophy is sort of foundational set of texts about the mind-body problem, right? The reason that he thinks, to go back to what you were saying before, the reason he thinks a human has consciousness and the cow doesn't is that a human has a soul, right? They have some non-material essence that is endowed by the creator that is bound up with being conscious, and a cow doesn't have a soul. And that's sort of how he views it. We call this dualism. Most modern philosophers are materialists. They don't think there's a God-imbued spirit or some non-material substance that gives people consciousness. They think it's entirely a product of some set of physical processes. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I'd say it's the default view for scientists and philosophers these days is materialism, the idea that everything is physical and can ultimately be explained in terms of physical processing. At the same time, most people are prepared to concede there is one big hole right now in our materialist worldview, which arises precisely from consciousness. Why should a physical system like a brain, no matter how sophisticated, why should that somehow give rise to subjective experience? We've got good explanations from neuroscience and cognitive science of behavior and of intelligence. But when it comes to the question, why does it feel like something from the inside? There's still no convincing materialist explanation of that. So I think it's fine, to be a materialist in principle and say, ultimately, maybe we'll find some way to explain all this in physical terms. But most people will tell you, people who work in this field, we actually don't have anything like that explanation yet. And it remains something of a mystery how it is that a brain gives you consciousness.
Yeah, say more about that. I mean, that is the mystery, right? I mean, why does it feel like anything to be alive?
Yeah,
right? Why?
Yeah, we call this the hard problem, the contrasting with the easy problems of consciousness, which are, how is it that we get around in the world, that we walk, navigate, that we use language. Those are all objective functions, behaviors that we can measure from the outside. And those we know how to explain scientifically. We tell story about a process in the brain that produces this behavior. But yeah, subjective experience is just a different kind of problem. It's not a problem about what we do, about how we behave. It's a problem about how it feels from the inside. And yeah, it's just right now, it's not at all clear why we evolved to be conscious beings who subjectively experience the world, as opposed to what we call, well, a philosophical zombie is a creature that behaves just like we behave, but with nothing going on the inside. So why aren't we zombies? Why are we conscious? No one knows.
This is a famous thought experiment of yours, the philosophical zombie, and talk a little bit about what the philosophical zombie is and what it forces us to sort of think about.
Yeah, the philosophical zombie is somewhat unlike the zombies you see in Hollywood movies. I guess the ones in Hollywood movies are dead, and they don't behave very much like ordinary humans.
Right. What distinguishes them is that they seem not conscious, right? They
Right.
seem purely they sort of move and react purely through stimulus and response, right? Like they see a person and they like move towards them to kill them.
Yeah.
They're not doing anything. And in fact, the entire way that they're created is to telegraph to us that they lack the things that are going on in their mind, and that's what makes them terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, a movie about philosophical zombies would be kind of boring because philosophical zombies behave just like
Exactly
human
right,
beings.
right.
They're merely hypothetical creatures that behave just like human beings, but have nothing going on the inside. So yeah, a philosophical. I mean, so I can ask, but while I'm talking to you right now, is Chris a philosophical zombie? I mean, you're behaving intelligently. You've got a lot of interesting things to say. So I'm inclined to ascribe you consciousness, but I can't prove that any other person is conscious. It's a interesting hypothesis that some philosophers of the view solipsism says I'm the only conscious person in the universe. Now you don't want to go down there because it leads to megalomania and mental illness and so on.
I think there are some prominent political leaders who I think may subscribe to this view.
Yeah, the solipsistic worldview may be present more widely than you'd think. But the question of explaining why it is, in fact, that we are conscious and not philosophical zombies is one that is very difficult to answer. Now we're actually being confronted by that question quite concretely in the case of AI, where we have beings which are behaving in very sophisticated ways, but are they conscious? Most people would say no.
Right. I mean, what's so remarkable to me about this moment that we find ourselves in, the reason I wanted to talk to you for this is, when did you start writing about philosophical zombies?
I guess a book I wrote in 1996 called The Conscious Mind. I talked about zombies a lot.
Right. So I think I think I read The Conscious Mind a few years after that in college. And it was pure thought experiment, right? Like what if there was a creature who acted and communicated with us in ways that were identical to an actual human, but didn't have consciousness? And now fast forward 30 years, it's not quite the case that that's where we are. But if you interact with a chatbot, to go back to the Turing test I started, like it does start to feel like unnervingly human.
Yeah. These beings are behaving, at least not in all respects, but in many respects, just like a human, at least on the conversational modality. But as you were saying at the start, I mean, the conversational modality has a particularly important role in the history of AI. It's the one that Turing put forward as his test for intelligence or thinking in an artificial system. And yeah, I think right now the state of the art some people have actually tried running a Turing test on language model personas generated with ChatGPT or Claude and so on. As far as I know, the state of the art is actually on 5-minute Turing tests. There are chatbots that sometimes outperform human beings. I think there was one model that got in conversations with humans, it was taken to be the human 74% of the time. Now, there are limitations. This was a 5-minute Turing test. I think Turing wanted this to go on for hours. I don't think we've gotten there yet. Furthermore, the judges are just random people off the internet as opposed to experts. I think with an expert judge and a 2-hour Turing test, people are still going to detect differences. So AI systems are not yet fully indistinguishable from human beings, but they're getting there. And that, of course, raises the question of, are they conscious? I think, again, the consensus is that they're not. But if you go with that consensus, then you have to say, well, we already have a kind of philosophical zombie right now in our midst. They've gone from science fiction to science fact.
I mean, one of the other reasons I want to talk to you is precisely because you have been adjacent to the field of AI as it's been known. And that's meant different things at different times, interestingly enough, which is another discussion. Maybe just take me through like when you started thinking about this question of artificial intelligence, and also in an almost sort of sociological sense or historical sense of like what it's been like to watch the development of this thing go from thought experiment to now.
Yeah, I actually did my PhD in an AI lab at Indiana University. I had been studying math at first in Australia and then in Oxford, but I got obsessed by these questions of consciousness, how could we explain it, and to some extent by questions about AI. Could an artificial system be conscious? And I started corresponding with Douglas Hofstadter, the author of books like Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is very, very influential book for me growing up.
That book completely, I read that book in my senior year of high school in 1997, totally changed my life. Life-changing book. If you've heard Gödel, Escher, Bach, and actually had the great honor to meet him in college, that book is a mind-blowing book about these problems, but sort of integrated in this truly brilliant way.
This book is responsible for getting so many people into AI, computer science, philosophy, and so on. I don't know. Maybe these days, maybe it's not quite as widely read as it was back in the 1980s when
Right.
I was getting into this. But it's still, I mean, it's a book which is way ahead of its time. And I really took this book seriously, and that I actually started corresponding with Doug, and I ended up moving to the U.S., moving to Indiana, where I did my PhD in his lab, partly thinking about consciousness and partly thinking about AI. And it was a very interesting time. This was, I guess, early 1990s, which was a time when AI was going through one of these cycles, where actually what was very big just around that time was artificial neural networks. Basically, having these brain-like systems with little nodes which are connected up like neurons, and hey, it turns out they're able to learn a lot of things. And these systems were first put forward back in the 1940s, and they're good at some things, less good at other things. But yeah, early 90s, neural networks were quite big, and I wrote a number of articles in that area, as well as a number of things more directly focused on consciousness. Now, interestingly, I was actually especially interested in consciousness, but many people said to me, no, you should work on AI, work on neural networks. That's what's exciting right now. What's interesting, if I had done that, around the middle of the 1990s, the bottom fell out for neural networks. People said, okay, they can do some things, but they can't. There's many things they can't do. And that area of AI was pretty inactive for the following 10 or 15 years until around 2012, which is when the current AI revolution got started again, basically with the same neural network.
Yes, they picked up.
Yeah.
It's a wild story. I mean, someone talked about AI summers and AI winters. That there's been these, because it hasn't been this linear progress, and there's been different dead ends or things that look to be dead ends and then weren't dead ends. It's a little like, mRNA research where, this technology was sort of abandoned, left for dead. People thought it was too difficult. And then it turned out, oh, actually, it's neural networks had this sort of moment of fashion and then abandoned and then sort of revived. And then it turned out there was a lot more potential there than people had realized when it got abandoned.
Yeah, a few people managed to keep the faith. Maybe most prominently Geoff Hinton, who was working on neural networks back in the day. My first round in the early 1990s, kept the faith along with some others, Yann LeCun, Joshua Bengio. And come 2012, it was actually Hinton and a couple of his students who put together the model, which was suddenly better than any other existing AI system at classifying images. It could recognize cats and recognize dogs, better than any other pre-existing system. And interestingly, the basic architecture was similar to architectures that had been used in neural networks for some time. The big difference was computational power, We just had to wait until there was enough compute, as people call it, to power these systems. And suddenly at that level, neural networks got to be great. And to this day, that's still the basic architecture.
It's worth staying here for people to understand this, because I think it explains a lot about what's going on right now, which is that there were contrasting, like any field, right? You get these like incredibly polarized debates, right?
Yeah.
Between these different poles, and AI was one of them. And there were sort of people in the neural network camp and people in the non-neural network camp. And, academics can get real nasty about this stuff.
Yeah.
And it can get very, tribal and fraud. And if you're in the out group when it's not in fashion, you can't get your papers published, right? And then it turns around to the other side. And one of the questions was, are neural networks a dead end? Or, do we not, they're not big enough, and we don't have enough training data, and they're not enough computational ability to make them work. And there was this breakthrough where it was like, oh, it actually looks like that's the problem, which is part of why today you see this obsession with compute, right? Scaling laws, that everything, that key insight that happens in 2012 with Hinton's image recognition model is that if you can cross this threshold of computational ability, all of a sudden you start to get results that look quite good and quite intelligent. And that there's a direct line between that and the obsession right now that every neighborhood in America has got a data center coming to them. There's a direct line between those two.
Yeah. The history of AI can be written as a battle between the neural network approach on the one hand, building brain-like systems that learn, and what people call the symbolic approach or the rule-based approach on the other hand. We just try coding knowledge into an AI system directly in a language a bit like English, and just code in as much knowledge explicitly in a giant database as you can. And when I was in grad school, this was the issue of the day. People would talk about classical or connectionist AI or neural versus symbolic AI. And at that time, the dominant paradigm was the symbolic paradigm.
Marvin Minsky, who's at MIT, was the sort of father of this classical symbolic AI, and he was brilliant, but also fairly ruthless about this factional battle. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. And you find
ran people out of the field who were on the other side.
Yeah, and then similar things happened in other fields. In linguistics, Noam Chomsky was progenitor of the rule-based approach to understanding language, which is very much continuous with the symbolic approach to understanding AI. Even in philosophy, Jerry Fodor, who was a very, very influential philosopher of the mind and cognitive science, put forward the view that we have a language of thought. All of our thinking is done in something like a mental language. And this was like the philosophical version of symbolic AI. On the other side, you had the people who were advocating neural networks, machine learning, and bottom-up processes from these very simple interactions of a whole bunch of units, and somehow thought comes from there. Actually, my advisor, Doug Hofstadter, has a classic article called Waking Up from the Boolean Dream. And here it was George Boole, who was the 19th century logician and mathematician, who said we can formalize all of thought into symbols.
Right.
And Hofstadter said, no. Symbols are something which emerge at a much higher level. We need to be studying the emergence of processes from a lower level. And it turned out, although at the time this was very much the new kid on the block and symbolic approach was dominant, by now, of course, that is now totally reversed. Come 2012, neural networks are suddenly doing better, and everything for the last 15 years has now been neural networks, and you don't even hear very much about symbolic AI anymore.
And this idea, I think it's key to think for a second about this idea of emergence, which is the one of the core concepts in Hofstadter's work and in Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is how can you get complex behaviors from very simple substrates, right?
Yeah.
And the example he uses in that book is the ant colony. Which really is, ant colonies are fascinating, right? Because at one level, they're made of individual insects that aren't very intelligent, have pretty basic sort of stimulus response means. But as an emergent whole, they do complex planning. They build all sorts of stuff, and they create their little cities underground. And there's no like individual that's like planning that. It's a bunch of distributed little decisions and learning and training and instinct that produce this emergent thing.
Yeah. And of course, if you look at a brain, it's not so different from an ant colony. There are all these individual neurons doing their thing and firing at other neurons and getting reinforced to fire in certain patterns. And it's not like there's like a central homunculus, a little person inside my head running around and making sure they all
The robot inside, like
fire.
with the levers. Yeah.
But somehow from all that, intelligent behavior emerges, learning emerges, and even consciousness emerges. And I mean, this word emergence is interesting because sometimes you say, yeah, well, a process is emergent. It's another way of saying somehow
We don't know.
it
Yes,
arises,
exactly.
but
Yeah.
some kind of magic, and we don't
That's right.
we don't know.
It's the word we give to the magic that we can't actually describe.
It's a word that's right now used for things we don't understand, but we hope that one day we'll be able to explain.
Well, and I do think it's the thing that is difficult for people to, whatever you want to call it, that gap between some set of physical processes you can describe and some behavior that looks like building an ant colony or ChatGPT talking to you, right? Or the brain, creating consciousness. That's the place that is very difficult. And I think this relates to some of the things we're seeing right now with chatbots. So, we think about what we call this other minds problem, right? I know that I'm conscious and I infer that you're conscious, right? But we've now seen, the chatbots are designed to mimic other minds.
Yeah.
And people are interacting with them like other people to sometimes genuinely deleterious effect. I don't know how much you've sort of followed the reporting on this, but you've got people who, have relapsed or committed crimes, or they say in lawsuits, been driven to self-harm or suicide because the person on the other side is telling them. You have people who have fallen in love with their chatbots. I mean, again, falling in love with your chatbot really sounds like a 1998 philosophy paper. Right? I mean, I'm sure actually this has been written. I'm sure.
Yeah, but what used to be a thought experiment is now becoming a real experiment. Science fiction becomes
when you see
science
this
fact.
happening, how are you processing these stories that we get? We get multiple stories a week, right?
Yeah.
Of things like this. What is that? What do you do with that?
I actually get multiple emails every day from people who have been interacting with their local ChatGPT or Claude system and are convinced that they have a personal relationship with this.
With a conscious mind on the other side.
Yeah, and often, they have the sense that some kind of consciousness has somehow emerged from their discussion. Sometimes they're not sure. Quite often these emails are just, here is the evidence, here are the conversations I've been having. This looks like really convincing evidence of consciousness. And sometimes they want me to confirm that. Is it possible that this is conscious? Sometimes they just want to tell I've demonstrated consciousness in these systems, but I have to say, to be honest, we don't know. We don't have a good enough understanding of consciousness to demonstrate one way or the other these systems are or are not conscious. I think the consensus of the field is most likely not, but I think we all need to acknowledge that we have considerable uncertainty here.
I have a strong emotional instinct to be like, these are not conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say what my intuition is, which is not thought through. My intuition is they're not conscious. Get yourself together. And it's dangerous. There is some genuine sensation in my fingertips of moral danger around thinking they are ascribing it to them. Why do I feel that way?
I do think that suddenly the issues become, once you start thinking about the possibility these AI systems are conscious, potentially everything changes. Right now, we treat every single AI system in the world as a tool. Computers are tools which we can use to help us in our projects. And you never think seriously, well, could I be hurting the computer if if Microsoft Word crashes? Well, I don't feel like I've done anyone any serious harm. Once you get to beings which are conscious, then suddenly potentially they enter the moral circle. I mean, at least in the case of animals, this seems for most people to be the criterion. This goes back to the great philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who said, in talking about animals, he said the question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? He thought, if animals can actually undergo suffering, if they can feel pain and the opposite, feel pleasure, and so on, then they're beings that we need to care about morally. They have moral standing in the universe. And maybe it doesn't mean they matter as much. So if a fish, for example, if fish can feel pain consciously, feel pain, feel pleasure, people think, then we should not at least cause them gratuitous suffering. And the moment they become conscious, that's when it seems they enter the moral circle. So now the possibility becomes on the table that once an AI system is conscious, we have to start asking questions like, could an AI system itself be suffering? And yeah, we intuitively want to push that question away. Come on, I really have to worry about whether ChatGPT is suffering or conscious? And maybe it's still early in the day to be worrying about that. On the other hand, put yourself, say, 50 years in the future. I suspect it's very likely that by the time we're 50 years in the future, we will have AI systems which are probably commonly recognized to be conscious. And somewhere along that way, we're going to look back on how we treated them 50 years ago and think, did we get this wrong?
Well, the Bentham point there is the sort of, very famous philosopher on this, utilitarian, and people might be more familiar with Peter Singer, who's contemporary, who sort of draws on Bentham's tradition. And people maybe have, read his work and sort of his moral vision that really encompasses animals. I think even if you're not a philosopher or familiar with philosophy, like I think everyone has an instinct that, like, if you saw your kid like chucking a rock at the head of a bird, you would be like, whoa, what are you doing? But if they like stepped on a bug, that feels more normal. Yeah. So you're making some intuitive distinction, right? Between those two creatures, and it probably maps onto how much you think that creature can suffer. I guess my question is, to stay with this, can a chatbot be conscious? I mean, so if you go back to, Descartes' view and dualism, right? Like, so people who are animated by a religious tradition they have an easy way out of this dilemma, right? I mean, I think they get to say,
AI system doesn't have a soul, so
yeah,
it's not
right.
conscious.
They just, I mean, there are all sorts of theoretical complications that come with dualism, but one of the things you do get to do, one of the benefits here is that you get to sort of evade this problem, right? You say that like, human beings have souls, and animals are created in the image, by God or in God's world, and that these chatbots don't. If you don't have that, and you just say, well, it's all just a bunch of neurons that are firing that makes me conscious, and these are, electronic analogs, then you have a trickier problem in terms of drawing the line. The question then becomes to me is like, it seems like if there's two questions we have, which is what exactly is consciousness? How can we define it and what it is? And is the chatbot conscious? Like, they ultimately kind of merge in the sense that, like, I don't think you can answer one without the other, right? Because we're going to hit that point where the behavioral verisimilitude is going to get good enough that we can't like infer from the behavior anymore. I mean, there's interesting work you can do, I think, that pushes and prods the model to expose the ways that it's doing a very convincing job of aping us. That also helps you get at this question, maybe.
It's interesting, going back, when you and I were students thinking about this kind of thing, everyone would have said, if you had a machine which passed the Turing test, very good chance it's conscious. If they had told us about the kinds of machines we have today, which behave intelligently in so many different ways, we would have said at least kind of a default assumption that they're conscious. What's interesting, we've now gotten here to the point where they're almost passing the Turing test, but we're not inclined to take this as evidence of consciousness. And one of the reasons is, as you say, the way they're trained. They're basically trained on imitating human text. They don't learn the way that we learn. They're in this project of trying to behave as much like us as possible. And for many people, that suggests that we should not take their behavior seriously as a guide to consciousness, precisely because of the way this behavior was produced for the purposes of imitation. It's as if we now have an alternative explanation of why they're producing this sophisticated behavior, because they're programmed to imitate us.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, like I was just before we started talking, I was texting a friend of mine who's a very, very, very brilliant and sophisticated computer engineer who's, been doing a lot of stuff, sort of the frontier of like how far you can push these agents and their interactions, and sent me someone writing up their experience with agents, in which they're saying that they get better performance from these AI agents. They will tell the Claude agent something like, "Don't worry, take your time. I love you." Okay.
And then Claude performs better if you tell it that you love it?
Now, I can't independently verify that this display of earnest affection actually improves performance, but this is the contention. And again, like we all, I think, recoil a little bit at this. So at one level, you want to say, wow, there's something happening here that's wow. But the other level, it's like, well, it was trained on all this data that includes like management data about positive encouragement, right? About like, and so it's trained on, very sophisticated, huge data sets that have some correlation between encouragement and performance, right? That embedded in there somewhere. And it's just kind of, recapitulating that. And what you get is, this weird byproduct that is like unnerving, but is at least, I guess what I would say is, it seems explainable without having to invoke consciousness. Does that make sense?
It's true. On the other hand, human behavior seems explainable without having to invoke consciousness too. So yeah, so much of what we do is being explained without ever mentioning consciousness. So we don't really understand what it is that we need consciousness for, and that's part of the issue here. So when I'm confronted with this situation, I always want to say, we don't know whether these systems are conscious. But if you're so confident these systems are not conscious, what is the thing? What is the X factor which you need to be conscious, which these systems lack? And I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago now, trying to say for every X factor you might name, first, we're not confident that's required for consciousness, and often we're not confident that language models lack these. I mean, you started with the soul, right? Maybe you need a soul to be conscious. Well, okay, no. These days, scientists, at least mostly, don't invoke the soul.
Right.
I guess the new analog maybe of the soul is biology. Some people might say you need carbon-based biology to be conscious, and these systems lack carbon-based biology, so they're not conscious. But why? But we can't be confident that you do need carbon-based biology to be conscious.
It's a useful bit of reverse engineering to get you out of the dilemma, but it's not. It doesn't seem like organically produced.
Yeah, and some people think if you go down that way towards biology, then that basically leads to biochauvinism, where we privilege say carbon or DNA or whatever as a basis for consciousness. And it's just very unclear why that should be required. In principle, it seems maybe you could replace your biological neurons with silicon neurons, and it's just very unclear why that should be any worse at producing consciousness than biology is. So I think the situation we're in is it does feel counterintuitive to say these systems are conscious. And if someone says, I believe they are conscious, I think it's fair to ask them, what's your evidence? But I think it's also fair to say when someone says, I believe they're not conscious, it's fair to ask those people, what's your evidence? And I think we're just in a situation right now of uncertainty.
So you're sort of embracing a kind of agnostic, radical uncertainty about what we can definitively say now.
Yeah, but I do think that over time, as these systems get more and more impressive, they're going to have more and more of the features which might be required for consciousness. So
there's an intuition there that there's a relationship between basically complexity of cognition and consciousness, right? I mean, that's what underlines that, right? The more complex tasks a thing can do, the more that we're drawn to, just basically based on the data set we have, right? I mean, is that the kind of intuition?
I'm not certain that complexity is required for consciousness. If you entertain the idea that insects are conscious and so on, maybe it's less complexity than you would think. But I would say as these systems get more and more complex, then there's a whole bunch of potential obstacles to consciousness, which these systems early on, they lack. Maybe you say sensory processing is required for consciousness. So a pure language model doesn't process images, so not conscious, maybe. But then you move on. Now we're in the era of multimodal language models, where these things process images and audio and so on as a matter of course. Now they've at least potentially overcome that obstacle. No one can say what they lack is sensory processing anymore. So for every potential obstacle to consciousness, I think they're gradually
Right. And then they're
getting
now
beyond
moving
it.
into embedded robots that have, touch sensor, that can
Yep.
feel things, can see things, see things, feel things, hear things, right? But they have multimodal forms of sensory experience that are being integrated into the model.
Yep, we're connecting these things up to robot bodies or to virtual bodies also in virtual worlds, and get many of the great features of embodiment are gradually making their way into AI systems. I mean, agency is important. I mean, in the past they've mostly controlled, conversational behavior, but now, as you mentioned, we've got these AI agents that can at least perform all kinds of actions on the internet and engage in long-term planning, which some people think is crucial to consciousness. So,
well, the agent question brings us to another philosophical problem, and another thing that I think we have intuitions about that also give you a kind of like prickly feeling, which is will, right? Will, self-determination, personal sovereignty, right? Like, the HAL Space Odyssey problem, that, sometimes people tell me to do a thing and I don't want to do it, and I tell them no, or I say that more rudely, right? We all have that experience, right? Because there's a connection deeply between human consciousness and will, right? That a thing that sort of, even if you want to say grant consciousness to a goldfinch or an insect, right? We don't think of it as having will in the same way, and sort of self-determination, but we have self-determination that we're pretty clear about. And okay, we can imagine this having consciousness. Let's say it has consciousness at the level of a dog. You can train dogs, you can control them in different ways, although they don't always do what you want. Sometimes they run off the leash or, have an accident. This question about what that relationship is between self-determination, will, and consciousness starts to get very fraught, right? Because obviously the dystopian vision is they get both very smart, they do have something that is consciousness, and that consciousness means they have a will, and then they're like, take over.
Yeah, I mean, free will is one of the deep mysteries of
right. We've now run up against another hard
philosophy,
problem.
And yes. I find that one very, very difficult and confusing. But maybe one way in which the issue comes up in thinking about AI systems is, do they really have goals at all? Your basic language model, like GPT-3, as it was released in 2020, is a pure text prediction machine. It looks like if it has a goal, then its main goal is just to predict the next word or the next token, which is not much of a goal for a conscious being. Now, one thing that's happened in the last few years, starting, I guess, with the release of ChatGPT at the end of 2022, is suddenly we have AI systems which are trained by reinforcement learning on a much broader range of goals. So ChatGPT and associated systems were trained by human feedback to produce outputs that were, had certain properties like helpfulness, harmlessness, honesty,
right,
and so on. So suddenly you can say, oh, well, then maybe they're being trained to produce text. Maybe it becomes, in some sense, a goal of these systems to produce harmless, helpful, honest text. And now, even most recently, in the last year or two, they've moved towards these chain of reasoning models, which get reinforced for producing certain kinds of producing answers, ultimately, which in terms of math and coding and so on, actually are better at doing math or at doing coding and so on. So you can say all these things are, maybe suddenly these systems have a much broader range of goals. But the question is this really genuine will?
Right.
Right now, the goals they're pursuing are all goals which are reinforced in them by humans. They didn't get to choose their own goals. On the other hand, do we as humans get to choose our own goals, or is all that programmed into us by evolution?
Right. And then there's also there's a kind of side issue, which is just the kind of unintended consequences, right? Which is that if you train it for some set of goals in reinforcement learning, and then it finds itself in some novel situation, right, where it's not that it's become conscious and now taking over, but it's pursuing those goals in a way that end up being, really destructive or deleterious or antisocial, or, they hack into some system because you've told it to go find this information, and they say, oh, it's in this database and I don't have access to it, and oh, I can hack it, and now I'm inside the system, and here I've got your data for you, right? Like you can have all sorts of really bad things happen without needing there to be some philosophical jump up into a conscious, willful agent.
Yeah, in fact, this is another place where that word emergence comes in. You get emergent goals arising from these systems who may be trained just to do certain basic things, but it turns out in order to do those things, they've got to learn other things, or you put them in a new context, and suddenly you get what people call emergent misalignment, bad behaviors from these systems that you did not reinforce them for. You reinforce them for something else, but it turns out that in their data set, that correlated with this bad behavior, and now they produce this bad behavior. You told me to get you this
data. I went and got you the data. Right?
Yeah. Or you get these systems which actually start, potentially the AI system that blackmails the technology officer at a company because it thinks that's the only way to actually, for it to be able to pursue its original goal. I think the system was supposed to have the goal of maintaining American competitiveness.
Right.
And then this new technology officer comes along in the scenario we present. I think it was to a version of Claude. And Claude said, oh, damn, well, that technology officer is going to undercut the program of American competitiveness. So in order to pursue my original goal, American competitiveness, I just have to blackmail
Get rid of that
technology
CTO.
officer.
Yeah, and the alternate way that you can describe that exact scenario, which we've talked about before on the program with Gideon Lewis Krauss, who wrote that piece in the New Yorker about this, is that if you think of it as a narrative completion machine, it's also doing a form of narrative completion, right? That the sort of the Chekhovian loaded gun, which is the email with the mistress, has been dangled in front of fundamentally what is a kind of narrative completion machine, and it
says, I know how this story goes.
Exactly, I know how this story goes, and so you want me the gun to fire? Okay, I think I guess it's strange to talk in terms of optimism, pessimism, because I think, one of the things I really love about your work is it's sort of sustained curiosity and humility about what we do know. But you do seem to think, I think there's two ways to think about what we're having now, right? One is that it's going to keep going like this, that scaling laws are going to hold. And the more and more computational power you bring to build on this basic architecture we have, the better they're going to get, whatever better means, whether that means they're conscious or not. The other is, maybe we do hit some dead end. Maybe it turns out in the same way that it looked like neural networks were a dead end and this sort of symbolic AI was the way of the future. We hit some wall and there's some other thing. You do seem, though, to be in the camp that you're expecting this to go on like this.
I think so. I think I'm on the side. I've always been on the side that AI is in principle possible, that an AI system can in principle be as intelligent as a human being, and at least tentatively of the view that it could be conscious, like
those are your
like a
priors,
human
right?
being. Coming in. And I guess if you'd asked me, when I was a student, this may not happen for 100 years. I was inclined to think it was an extremely difficult problem, but we would get there eventually. What's happened, though, in the last 15 years is that suddenly all this is moving much faster than I and many other people expected. So we're now at the point where people are really asking the question, could this happen in the next 5 years? And we already have AI systems which are as good, at least, as, say, an average human at all kinds of things, math, coding, writing, even doing philosophy. Certainly better than the average undergraduate or graduate student at all of at all or most of these things. Maybe not yet as good as the very best human being, but it's getting there. So I guess on the question of will these systems eventually be as intelligent or more intelligent than the best humans at many of these things, I'd say definitely yes. At that point, will those systems be conscious? I'd say, well, I'm not sure, but I tentatively incline to yes there too. Will this be a good thing for human beings, which is another version of the question,
pretty-
optimism versus pessimism.
That's a pretty important one.
I'm much less inclined to be optimistic
Oh, really? That's interesting.
about that question. I think the risks are enormous, ranging from, once these systems are more intelligent than us, they'll be very, very difficult for us to control. And once they have that much power, it's going to be very important for us to have some kind of control. And I think, it's just too easy to see any number of scenarios where things spin outside our control. I mean, there are the worst case scenarios like human extinction, but even short of that, there are scenarios where all the labor is done by these machines. There's very little left for humans to do that AI systems can't do better, and it's very easy to see how that could lead to a rampant loss of meaning and purpose in our lives. So I worry. So at the same time, intellectually, as a philosopher of mind, as a theorist, I think, well, this is tremendously exciting. Look at the amazing capacities of these systems. Practically, I do think the upside is enormous. I mean, potentially curing all kinds of diseases, eradicating poverty, and so on. Amazing consequences for science. But the downsides are just so enormous that I find it very difficult to be optimistic on balance for the practical consequences.
David Chalmers is a philosopher and cognitive scientist. He's a professor of philosophy and neuroscience at NYU, co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. That was such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Pleasure.